Thank you very much, Leid and Pascal, for inviting me to this series of lectures. Indeed, 2012, we started the excavation together with the University, but we started at the site earlier in 2004 and 5, together with the University, with Omar Al-Ghul, who is also here, which is very nice. So the Damiyah started in 2004, and since 12, the new excavations started. I'm especially glad to give a lecture because this, and it's different from other lectures, is that it has no end. So I probably end with a lot of questions to you, and that has a reason that I don't know the answer often, but also that we are almost at the end of our final publication. So the manuscript is almost finished, except for the conclusions. And in these conclusions, some of the answers I hope to give answers on the questions I asked today. So you are more like an advisory board for me today. So yeah, if you have any suggestions or good answers, please, even afterwards, you can email me because it's an interesting site. And the second title, Remarkable and Uncomfortable, already shows that there are some issues that, well, doesn't agree with the regular ideas about especially cult and religion. And that makes this small site very interesting as an example or as such, besides a very dense and nice occupation history from the late Bronze onwards. I will first start giving some, well, theoretical framework of cult and religion, very short, for those that are not very familiar with that. I concentrate on the Levant, but I think most of these ideas are also, well, valuable at other areas of the world. After that, I will concentrate on two phases of Tell Damiyah, Iron Age, shortly after each other. Stratum 8 and Stratum 7 both have cult or cultic activities, proofs of evidence of cult activities, and both have, well, different things that normally is found. The main question to ask, and this is how do archaeologists recognize cult, is important because what we see in the literature, especially in the southern Levant, is that every archaeologist starting a dig wants to find a temple, or at least a sanctuary, or at least cultic activities. It's something like you have to find it, otherwise your career is not finished almost. So you would expect that it is clear how to recognize cult. But in fact, if you read the literature, and well, Diederik Halbersma already published a nice article about that together with Bruce, it is not that simple. A few things that are used to recognize cult, and the main thing is architecture. And that's buildings with a similar ground plan have the same function. We see that like, well, almost like a pyramid of evidence, how you call that, is that it is over and over stated that a certain ground plan has a certain function. It means for example, two rooms, one room is closed, the altar is in the second room, not immediately visible from the entrance, etc., etc. So that means if you find a similar ground plan, you say this is a sanctuary or temple, or how do you define it? At least it is used for cultic activities. And that's, of course, as you can imagine, very dangerous. Presence of altars and benches are often used. If you find a bench, it is a public building and probably used for certain cultic activities. Courtyard with a vavissa or another pit with some objects in front of a building is used to explain the function of that particular building. Meaning, if you find in a courtyard a certain vavissa or a figurine or something, you look at the building that is closest to that, and that will immediately has some special function of cultic activity. But there are so many rooms of variation and deviating situations that you should be very careful of using architecture alone to identify cult. So we have a lot of mobile and immobile cult objects, of course. Figurines, I already told it. Shrines, pottery stands, statues. Well, there are a lot of different objects that archaeology used to identify cult or cultic activities, and this as well to identify a certain place, a certain temple or sanctuary, a certain building. So if you find a figurine in a building, you immediately think of some activities going on there. And you can, of course, use these criteria. So if you find a figurine and a pottery stand, you have enough arguments to suggest that the temple itself or the building itself is a temple. There are lots of these kind of criteria. Renfrew and others already made these criteria, and every person who start again has different criteria. Altars and benches are always used as well. So all these criteria are used to identify, and none of the temples has all criteria. So the list is almost endless if you put all the different criteria together of the different authors. Unfortunately, most of the buildings are empty. And it means that objects are found near buildings or in a different situation, so that it's often very difficult to put a certain object for sure in a certain building. Strangely enough, there are very rare, very seldom buildings found with objects that are really without doubt in situ. Nevertheless, we have dozens and dozens of temples and sanctuary in the southern Levant. And as last, and there are probably more even, but texts, of course, are sometimes useful. I call them Jerusalem, for example, is a nice example. That temple or is probably an Iron Age temple, but well, there are not so many real evidence for this. And of course, well, not historically correct. They are not intended to be, in normal cases, historical correct. So we're going to Damiyah with this in the background. I come back to these three items, or especially two, later on in the lecture. But first, I would like to introduce Tell Damiyah. It's a small site in the Jordan Valley for those that are not familiar with the area. Jordan Valley, located, well, it looks like as if it is a border, but it's not a border. People working in the Jordan Valley, you have a rich history, a lot of sites that are excavated, a lot of information about Bronze and Iron Age. So we have a good background and a good basis to use for Tell Damiyah. There, it's interesting to see, and I put an arrow there, that in the Jordan Valley there are different regions. You have the Gore and the Zor, and Tell Damiyah is one of the few sites that are located very near and very close to the Jordan River, which means, especially in the early period, that the site was surrounded by water after the river itself, during rainy periods, flooded the area. And that's important. Why do you want to put a site in an area that is flooded regularly? Probably the site not itself, it's like a peninsula in this area, but all the surrounding was flooded now and then, yearly. Of course, it is also fertile, which is interesting, and also an argument why people are staying there on the site. Most of the sites, especially Bronze and Iron Age, are located on the higher located Aurora. Like Tel Derola, Tel Saidia, Tel Mazar, all these big sites in the area are located not too far, walking distance, but on the higher located area. One of the questions we started in 2004 and 5 is why people have chosen this place. And one of the reasons is probably, and you can still see it if you look very closely to the picture, is that there is a ford, a place where people could pass and go to the other side, cross the river, and went to the other area, Palestine. It is thus, because of the flooding, a very volatile area today, but also in the past, so people could use the land for agriculture, animals, herding, well, hunting, for example, is also possible. So everything you say, well, it's a nice place to be. But 280 millimeter precipitation is not too much, especially if there are periods of drought. People will not stay here and will move to better areas. So especially visible at the other sides of the area, Tell this idea, is that people moved to the higher regions now and then, especially if you have a longer period of drought. Tell Damiyah, and that was already investigated and searched for in 2004 and 5, was not abandoned. So what we see is that the people living on Tell Damiyah stayed there during especially the late Iron Age without gaps. So in times that Kerala was empty of occupation, Damiyah was still occupied. In 2004, we started a small excavations work because of a bulldozer cut, probably by the military, and this uncovered, especially on the sides of the section, a huge layer with destruction debris. Probably dated at that time around 700, 850, 750, 650. At that time, it was not closely, perfectly dated, but it was later Iron Age, and with special objects that raises our awareness in 2004 and 5. So we continued in 2005 because the importance of the site. We discovered, among other things, also a cuneiform bulla with a cuneiform writing on it. Some objects that assumed to be cultic. After 2005, Pascal already said settling the Stepper project ended, so we had to wait until 2012 before continuing the excavation. And one of the questions was, of course, these cultic objects, but also the continuous occupation at the site. Why were people living there, whereas the rest of the Jordan Valley was empty or partly empty? So we started in 2012, 2013, together with the Yarmouk University and Professor Zedan Kafafi, and of course with students from Leiden University and the Yarmouk University, a specialist from different university, but always not a very big excavation. One of the things that we wanted is to publish on time. Well, it took a bit more time now to finalize the manuscript, but we wanted to excavate as much as we could study, and especially in the year that you excavate, you should study all the material in order not to have a backload of material and publication. The oldest occupation remains we excavated was on the foot of the site, and it was late bronze, 15th, 13th century BCE. It was dated by pottery. You see one of the Cypriot pottery milk bowls on the side, but also by C14 dates. It is expected that also under the big mound you have late Bronze Age occupation, like Kerala, like Sardinia, like all the excavated sites in the area. They started in the Middle Bronze, most of them continued in the Late Bronze, and then Iron Age occupation on top. But most of, especially also Damiyah, we probably will never reach the Bronze Age because you had to dig through 13, 14 meters of Iron Age occupation. The site itself is not very big. You should not think of a big settlement, more like a few houses that were on top. And that's important for the the rest of the lecture. You remember, the youngest occupation remains also to mention is the 20th century. Tell Damiyah was in the middle of the fights, of several fights actually, and wars. So people who have excavated at Tell Damiyah now and then found bullets, things that were left over from the military. When we started our excavation in 2004, there was also a small, watchtower on top of the site that was removed in 2005, I think, later on. At that time, you see the tracks of the cars, the military cars also run up or rode on the site itself, causing some erosion. So the bulldozer cut and the erosion was reason to excavate in 2004. I mentioned the youngest occupation because it damaged part of the site itself. Other periods that were excavated were cemeteries from the Ottoman and from the Byzantine periods, Hellenistic Persian pits, and for the rest mainly Iron Age. And two strata are important for today. That is Stratum 8 and Stratum 7. 7th century BC. I will position that a little bit more in detail later on, but it's about 750 till 680, more or less, the two phases. On your left side, you see one of the statues, anthropomorphic statues that we found in 2004 and 5, and reason to continue in 2012. It's about 80 centimeters high. As you can see, 2 arms, no head. And it was found in courtyard layers or street layers in front of a building. So 2 strata. Stratum 8 is the oldest one, and Stratum 7 later on. Almost, not more than 20 years probably difference in between, with a little occupational gap probably, but within 50 years 2 stratum. So this is one of the top plans we made, which for you, it's clear that there are 2 buildings, more or less, a complex in the southern part and a large, rectangular building in the north with thick walls. The residential house in the south was reused in the next phase, as you will see. There are some pits, the round places in the northern parts. A courtyard in front of the big house. The entrance of the big house was in the north, so not towards the courtyard that we excavated. And we said it's probably a sanctuary, and there are reasons to indicate or to suggest that. It is an imagination, but this might be the plan of the sanctuary. So this we excavated, and this is something we expect to be if we excavated the rest of the square. Unfortunately, the whole area was covered with cemeteries of 2 different phases, making it very time-consuming to reach these kind of levels. So in the courtyard, we found a podium of mud bricks and ashes. So there was burning taking place in this area. The altar itself was partly burned, so the fire was also, damaging or influencing the altar itself. There are several areas with large bones in this courtyard found. A crater in the sanctuary itself, not complete, unfortunately, because a later pit of the Hellenistic phase had cut this area and took part of the greater church with them. We found part of the craters also in other pits of the Hellenistic Persian period. So they moved this part of the crater to later, to other pits, probably not on purpose. Come back to the crater later on. And we found figurines, not in one place, but in several places. So all these items, altar, figurines, and a crater with a very nice drawing on it, give us some arguments to suggest that this thick-walled room is functioned as a sanctuary at least for some cultic activity. The residential house in the south was almost empty of finds, and those finds that were especially the pottery sherds suggest some cooking pots, some storage sherds, but nothing cultic in the sense. The crater, I've drawn the rim on the right side, right below. The crater was found on the floor, covered by some destruction debris, so it was probably in use during the final phase of the sanctuary or the building. And especially the drawing on this vessel was interesting. You see in the top, you see some mountains on the bottom, a line that probably is the surface, two animals and a tree, so a tree of life, you can suggest. Maybe there are people around with weapons. Well, there are several suggestions what these two, arrows are meaning. Maybe people, we don't know. There are some other similar objects found in the southern Levant, and they all suggest a cultic meaning of this. Not only the huge crater, because almost 44 centimeter diameter as this crater, thick walls, but also the shape of the crater itself and the drawing. Figurines in the courtyards were almost all complete, and that's important to remember later on. They are all female. At least 4 or 5 of them are dated to the Iron Age, late Iron Age, so they fit the 8th, 7th century dating, and one is probably an earlier example, which is very intriguing. Why you find an earlier example, Iron 1, for example, and that's the black one, the second one from the right, why you find this kind of figurine and this type back in an Iron Age level. We did XREF on these, so we are very curious about the results. We hope to publish them in the final report. At least the first idea is that it's a different clay, so there are local production of the other vessel or other figurines, and the black one is probably not locally produced. But this is very preliminary. After the destruction of Stratum 8, was a short period with some erosion, but not probably a decade or so, or maybe 2, but not that much. And probably after 20 years, Stratum 8, they built a completely new buildings, at least two complexes, as you can see, one in the south, reusing the walls, renewing the walls, but they use the same plan. And in the north, you have a bigger complex. We didn't excavate the whole pop complex. It probably continues in the north and in the west, but these rooms have been excavated. An entrance to the site itself. We see that also on the walking levels that we excavated, that it is that steep going down, descending to the eastern slopes of the site. The street that continues, that is east-west. A residential house, again, now with objects in it, and it's completely domestic. So you find loom weights, you find grinding stones, you find cooking pots, regular bowls, some storage jars as well, but nothing that is different from domestic function. 2 storerooms in the northern complex and completely filled with pottery and with some content of the pottery. Come back to that. Stairs to the roof with a big question mark, because we don't know actually. There are no objects in this room. It's a strange room. It's not connected to any other rooms we know for now. So stairs are an option, possible. In one of the rooms, we found a huge roof roller that must have been on the roof itself. At the moment, it was destroyed. The whole level was destroyed. So there was a flat roof that might be used as well for, well, living, storing, something like that. But if it's really a stairs, we have no proof. There's no wood found, there are no stairs found, so it might not make it to the final publication, but I would like to mention it anyway. And we have two rooms that we now identified as sanctuary, and with a reason, of course. First to the storerooms. They were especially filled with pottery, broken pottery. The roof was collapsed. There is an idea about that these objects were purposely damaged. So each of the jars also had a stone next to it or on top of it. So it looks like if people had crushed the pottery before the roof collapsed. This is also something we had to continue working on it, but the stones on top of each of the jars is an argument to suggest it. Could also be a lid or something to close the pottery, but at the moment we favor the idea of objects were smashed before the whole complex was set on fire. Here are some of the objects that were jars, but also bowls were there, but it's surely it's a storeroom. So all the jars were filled with charcoal, probably not, well, maybe water, but we don't know that. But our archaeobotanists have found some barley in almost all vessels together with wheat. Some flax was found as well, but barley was the most important material found in these objects. The reason for these two kind of storeroom in a place that is not large, I mean, maybe 2 or 4 more houses were probably on top of the summit, but it was not a huge settlement. So the storerooms was filled with all this material is a strange thing and could also be something connected to the sanctuary. So why do we think it's a sanctuary? So it is 2 rooms. So you enter in the south. You don't see the main altar, which is in the western, against the western wall. So if a person enters, has to first enter, you see a first altar, and then you have to move to the west, and they see the second altar. Strange is is the arrow and the entrance or the passage near the main entrance. That is something that normally is not expected in a sanctuary. We found part of a statue next to the first altar in the first room. It's only a head. I will show a picture later on. Cattle skulls on one of the corners. So these 3 were placed probably on top of the floor. So they were not in the floor, they were covered with mudbrick debris and roof debris, but they were not part of a discarded animal, dead animals. And they look like if they pointing to the east, west, and the south. I don't know many similar parallels for this, but it looks like if it has some kind of a function. This animal skulls appear in Cyprus and in Egypt, but maybe in the southern Levant. So if anybody knows a good parallel for this, I would be happy to hear. The function of these, we don't actually know. And we found figurines next to the main altar, together with a pottery stand. And that is, well, for our first idea is that both were standing on top of the altar and were fallen to the north during the destruction, or thrown by a person who destroyed the house. The head, the statue, I showed you one of the objects, the statues from 2004. This head doesn't fit on that. So it's especially, we know that there are 2 or 3 of these kind of statues, but this type of objects are rare, but there are a few sites also in Jordan and on the other side of the Jordan River that with a similar shape always connected with cultic activities. This is a picture of the skulls. So you see that they are located on the floor in a good direction. So they are not placed or discarded there without reason, probably. The altar itself was made of mud brick. The whole house was also mud brick. There are very little stones, few stones in the area. So all the houses, the mud bricks are made of sun-dried mud bricks. And so also the altar itself was a rather big altar covered with plaster, white plaster. Unfortunately, before we realized that this is something we moved or we discarded or excavated the part of the mud brick structure, but happily we could save some of the mud bricks for further study. As you can see in the red, but it's a rectangular mud brick podium or altar. And the interesting thing is that after removing the altar, we discovered the skeleton of a snake. It was immediately below the mud bricks, for sure. We had a 3D scanner at that time on the site. So from Erwin Kanters, as you can see in the top, we scanned in 3D the skeleton remains. It was very brittle, but we talk about a snake of about 1.60 meters, so a rather large snake. We dated the snake because everybody will say, well, this is probably a modern one, scrolled there after, 10 years ago and died there. It's an old snake. The problem is dating bones. Well, you can see 884, 794 BCE is way older than the rest of the area. So, or the layer below this stratum 7 is that old, which doesn't fit with stratum 8 pottery. So we think that this skeleton is the dating is not very reliable. But what we can say is that it's definitely iron 2 and belong to the face. Together with this snake skeleton, we also discovered a crater. So it is under the floor, but above face stratum 8. And we might think of some kind of initial, some kind of an activity before constructing the sanctuary or constructing the podium, the altar. But it's an interesting, and maybe it has a certain function and a certain meaning of why should you put there a snake skeleton and then building an altar. Or it is just a coincidence that we found the snake over there. Let's go to the figurines and the pottery stand. Because interesting, if you remember stratum 8, only female figurines, and stratum 7 only, or except for one small fragment of a female figurine, only equids figurines or horse donkey figurines. They were found together with the pottery stands in the center. Sorry, they are not on the right side. The pottery stands, of course, much bigger. So it could be that the figurines are inside the pottery stands on top of the altar, but that's something, well, it's an hypothesis. The figurines itself, they are single-headed, but also two-headed figurines, sometimes with a rider on top and sometimes not. Partly painted, white, red, black, and they are almost all complete, which is also interesting as such. Just outside this building, we discovered 2 of these statues. One you already saw, found in 2004, and the others directly near the entrance to the sanctuary. You found the second one part. They were found in the street levels, probably not complete. So during the phase and not the end of the phase, because part of the courtyard layers and street levels run over a few of these sherds. So they were discarded before the end, before the destruction. And some other figurines, there you also see the part of the female figurine that was found, and more horse figurines also in the street. So if we summarize these 2 stratum 8 is a large one-room building with thick walls, thicker than the southern building. One mudbrick in the courtyard, a large amount of animal bones, and especially big bones in the street level, a complete female figurines in the courtyard, not centered that you can say, well, it is all of them are in one favissa or in one pit, but it might be that a few of them were excavated or were put there on purpose in a pit, but not all. So they were discarded in the courtyard during use. Stratum 7, large multi-room complex, 2 mudbrick altars inside the sanctuary. We did not find the courtyard. We assume that the courtyard of this building is more to the northwest, but we have no idea how that looked like. Complete equid or horse figurines in one room, one statue inside, and at least 2 outside. So if you compare these two, there are differences, and especially if we check the boxes, so to say, of architecture, cult objects, well, text we don't have in this stage, or not complete text that are used for for identifying cult. Tell Damiyah was not an isolated space or the sanctuary, and that is especially because of this entrance near the altar. If you look at most of the ground plans of sanctuaries and temples of the Bronze and the Iron Age in the Levant, you would not find any parallel, as far as I know, of an entrance near an altar. It is always suggested that this place is isolated, private, and surrounded by 3 walls. It is the reason why people are not seeing the main altar is also to have some kind of a private place to offer or to pray. Benches are absent in both rooms. We did not find anything. Could be of wood, for example. We don't know that, but there are no reason to suggest that there were any benches here. I already said that it might be not as isolated as we think. It might be a more communal and open practice. And if we say that benches are the main criterion for, then we probably not have, without the findings, we probably not have identified this as a cultic building. So if we just erase all the findings and the altars, this building was probably not identified as a sanctuary. We have 2 buildings that are on the same place. The 2 sanctuaries are more or less on the same place. But otherwise, it's difficult. And we can ask a few questions about that. To what degree is religious behavior reflected in architectural remains? So most of us are talking about religious sacred architecture, that architecture is religious or has some kind of a meaning. And you can ask, are buildings intended to be sacred or to become sacred? So what is more important? Is maybe the spot itself important? So it doesn't matter what kind of building you make on the spot, it will become sacred anyway. So it does not, so the shape of the building is not important, but the place of the building is important. And then you can say, well, if this is so different from the other areas and the other cultic buildings, was there truly a tradition in this kind of building? But we have 2 different buildings, completely different from each other, within 45, 50 years. So, or there are new people coming and completely changed it, but if they have the same sort of thinking about cult and religious, you would expect some sort of similar building. And one thing that struck me as well is that if you use buildings to identify cult, then everything inside a building will become secret or religious. I said even loom weights become secret. So if you look at the literature and you identify and people identify a certain building as religious, everything inside will be interpreted as religious or used in cult, which is a very different and strange idea if you consider that if you find a lumate in a different building, you will never think of cult. If we look at figurines, also that is something that is strange or intriguing, maybe it's the better word. So you have two different strata with two different assemblages of figurines. There are one female figurine or part of a female figurine found in stratum 7, so it's not completely 100%, but most of the complete objects in stratum 7 are horse figurines or donkey figurines, and in 8 are female figurines. And what does that mean? Figurines are always, or not always, but are thought, okay, it has a certain meaning, maybe resembling deities. But they also could resemble the person who offered them. And that is something that is not always thought of. If you find some female figurines, you always think of a female goddess. So the temple is resembling, or is a certain goddess is honored in that particular temple. I always think of a Greek and Roman tradition that is taken by archaeologists to put on the Iron Age. So certain temples are for certain deities. But was that the case in Bronze and Iron Age? Maybe the temple was used for all different kind of deities and not for only one. So if you, for example, offer a certain figurine, it is important for you, but maybe not resembling a certain deity. And interesting as well is the discovery of figurines that are complete. Because the idea that figurines are smashed before discarding, that they're broken before discarding, is not found in Tell Damiyah. We found especially in stratum 8, complete female figurines in the courtyard, so discarded. Later on, of course, some of the objects in stratum 7 are complete in the street levels. So they're not destroyed, at least not all are destroyed completely. So we should think of the idea of destroying figurines, and if that is really the case at other sites. I find this very interesting. Gerard van der Kooi, the name already was mentioned, taught me a lot of things, but also that you have to first look at the things on the ground. So if you excavate is don't mix it with some hypotheses or theories before you really know what happens in the ground. So take the things that you find as the basis and start then trying to find parallels and trying to find theories and about the site itself. We waited almost like 2 years before we called one of these stratum a religious phase or cultic activities. And that is something I think is very important, that you first look at the objects and then start trying to think of what it could be, what the function of the site itself. In this case, in Tell Damiyah, I think we have enough arguments, even though there are no benches. The architecture is different from most of the other temples and sanctuaries, that we have enough arguments to suggest a cultic function. I will not go into the importance of this site or the mentioning of the site in the Old Testament, but that might be one of the reasons why it is mentioned, that this site was important as a place where people could gather, a place where people could pray, or but has a special function for the area. And that's also the reason maybe that this place was never abandoned or partly abandoned, but continues almost during most of the Iron Age, whereas other sites in the area were abandoned because probably of drought in combination with other things like earthquakes. So this Tell Damiyah has an importance for at that time in the Iron Age, but also for us, because for me personally, it's a site that opens or changed the idea of cult and how we should look at it. And maybe we should think of a different and start over again to only take sites that has finds in situ as the basis for our ideas and theories about cult. Because now our whole idea about sites and religious architecture is based on the past, on empty buildings, and that were over and over used as an argument to suggest a cultic function, without thinking of that it might be completely different. And Tell Damiyah is a site that, well, put some is uncomfortable, I will call it, for these old theories about cult. So also small sites can be important. So I would suggest take a small site first and not starting excavating a very big sites, because these kind of small sites with intensive excavations and research can help us also in these kind of theories. Thank you very for your attention, and I hope of a lot of answers on the questions I asked.